The loudest people in the room rarely own the truth. The ballroom erupted with applause as Ethan Bennett stepped onto the stage beneath a canopy of crystal lights. The company logo shimmered across a massive screen behind him, while hundreds of employees, investors, partners, and executives filled the elegant venue. 15 years earlier, the business had started inside a cramped office barely larger than a storage room. Tonight, it occupied 3 floors of a downtown tower and generated millions of dollars each year. Ethan stood proudly at the center of it all. His tailored suit fit perfectly. His confident smile seemed practiced. The audience loved him. They always had. Claire Bennett sat quietly at a table near the front of the room, her hands folded around a glass of water. She wore a simple navy dress. Nothing flashy. Nothing designed to attract attention. Most people walking through the ballroom would never have guessed she was married to the man standing under the spotlight. She preferred it that way. The master of ceremonies introduced Ethan as a visionary leader. A builder. A risk-taker. A man whose determination transformed a dream into an empire. More applause followed. Ethan thanked the crowd and began speaking. He shared stories about the early years. Long nights. Financial struggles. Difficult decisions. The audience laughed when he joked about sleeping in the office. They applauded when he described signing the company's first major client. Claire listened silently. She had heard every version of these stories before. What Ethan never mentioned was who paid the first office deposit, who created the original operational systems, who spent months organizing records while he focused on sales. Those details rarely appeared in his speeches. At first, years ago, the omission bothered her. Eventually, she stopped expecting recognition. Ethan continued speaking as servers moved quietly between tables. The evening felt polished and celebratory. Then one investor near the front raised a question. "What is the secret behind your success?" Laughter and applause followed. Ethan smiled. He enjoyed questions like that. He leaned comfortably against the podium and looked across the audience. "Honestly," he said, "making decisions." More laughter. "Most people hesitate. I never did." The crowd nodded. Ethan's confidence filled the room. Then his gaze drifted toward Claire. A playful grin appeared. "Take my wife, for example." Several guests turned toward her. Claire remained still. Ethan chuckled. "Claire never liked making decisions." The audience laughed politely. Ethan continued. "For 15 years, she mastered the art of staying quiet." More laughter spread through the ballroom. Claire lowered her eyes briefly toward her glass. Around her, people smiled awkwardly. Some glanced between husband and wife. Others simply followed Ethan's lead. After all, he was the successful one. The founder. The public face of the company. Ethan raised his hand dramatically. "If there was a difficult choice, I handled it. If there was a risk, I took it. If there was a problem, I solved it." Applause followed again. Claire remained silent. The irony almost made her smile. Not because Ethan was entirely wrong. He had worked hard. He had sacrificed. He had built relationships that helped the company grow. But the story was never as simple as he made it sound. The audience saw a man standing alone at the summit. They never saw the person who spent years helping construct the mountain beneath him. Ethan eventually moved on to other topics. Revenue growth. Expansion plans. Future opportunities. The room returned to celebration. Yet something subtle had changed. Claire could feel it. Not because of embarrassment. She had long ago stopped caring about public jokes. The change came from somewhere else. A feeling she could not fully explain. As the speech ended, guests rose to their feet. Music filled the ballroom. Conversations resumed. Investors gathered around Ethan. Employees lined up to congratulate him. Claire slipped away from the crowd and walked toward a quiet hallway outside the event space. The noise faded behind her. For the first time all evening, she exhaled slowly. Her phone vibrated inside her purse. She almost ignored it. Then she noticed the caller identification. It belonged to a law firm she had not spoken with in years. Claire stopped walking. The hallway suddenly felt much quieter. She answered the call. "Mrs. Bennett?" a calm voice asked. "Yes. There is a document we need to discuss." Claire frowned slightly. "What kind of document?" A brief pause followed. Then the attorney spoke words she never expected to hear. "The original ownership records have been located." Claire stood motionless beneath the soft hallway lights. On the other side of the ballroom wall, hundreds of people continued celebrating Ethan Bennett. But for the first time in 15 years, something from the beginning had finally returned. Claire Bennett remained standing in the quiet hallway long after the call ended. The sounds of laughter and celebration drifted faintly through the ballroom doors behind her, but they felt distant now. Her phone rested motionless in her hand. The attorney's words continued echoing in her mind. The original ownership records have been located. For 15 years, she had not thought about those documents. Life moved forward. The company grew. The marriage changed. Priorities shifted. Yet suddenly the past was no longer finished with her. She slowly walked toward a small seating area near the elevators and sat down beneath a soft wall lamp. A few guests passed through the hallway without recognizing her. That was nothing new. Most people knew Ethan Bennett. Few paid attention to the woman standing quietly beside him in photographs. Claire stared through the large glass windows overlooking the city. Downtown lights stretched across the evening skyline. Traffic moved steadily below. Somewhere beyond those buildings existed the tiny office where everything began. The memory arrived with surprising clarity. 15 years earlier, the office contained little more than 2 desks, 1 computer, and a second-hand printer that jammed constantly. Ethan was ambitious from the beginning. He possessed energy that seemed impossible to exhaust. He believed the company could become something significant long before anyone else did. Claire believed in him. That was why she emptied nearly every dollar from her savings account. At the time, she worked a stable administrative position. The money represented years of careful planning. Yet when Ethan explained his dream, she never hesitated. The deposit for the office came from her account. The initial software subscriptions came from her account. The first payroll emergency came from her account. She never viewed those contributions as sacrifices. She viewed them as investments in their future together. Back then, they were partners in every sense of the word. While Ethan pursued clients, Claire handled operations. While Ethan attended meetings, Claire organized records. While Ethan spoke confidently about expansion, Claire built systems capable of supporting growth. Neither role seemed more important than the other. They simply worked together. Her phone vibrated again. The attorney had sent an email. Claire opened it slowly. Attached were scanned copies of documents older than the company itself. Incorporation papers. Initial shareholder agreements. Early operating records. She stared at the first page. The signatures looked familiar despite the passing years. Younger versions of themselves. Hopeful versions. A time before success complicated everything. Her eyes moved lower. Then she stopped. The ownership percentages appeared exactly as she remembered. Not because she studied them recently. Because she helped create them. Ethan had always focused on building the business. Claire focused on protecting it. The original structure reflected that balance. Over time, nobody discussed the arrangement anymore. The company became larger. New investors arrived. Lawyers updated records. Executives came and went. The foundation remained buried beneath years of expansion. Claire closed the document and exhaled slowly. A ballroom employee emerged through the nearby doors carrying event materials. Through the opening, she caught a glimpse of Ethan surrounded by admirers. He was smiling, shaking hands, accepting congratulations. Everyone saw a successful founder. Nobody saw the paperwork sitting inside her phone. The realization did not make her angry. Surprisingly, it made her sad. Not because Ethan received attention. Because somewhere along the way, he began believing his own version of the story. A second message arrived from the attorney. This one contained only a few words. "We need to meet tomorrow morning." Claire read the sentence twice. Then a third time. 15 years had passed without anyone questioning those original records. Why now? Why after all this time? She opened the final attachment. Unlike the others, this file had been created recently. Several pages carried legal notes and annotations. Near the bottom appeared a highlighted paragraph. Claire felt her pulse quicken. The note referenced an upcoming board governance review. She sat up straighter. The company board was scheduled to hold its annual strategic meeting in less than 2 weeks. Normally those meetings received little public attention. This year would be different. A recommendation for leadership restructuring had already been submitted. Claire stared at the screen. Leadership restructuring. The phrase felt heavier than it should have. Her thoughts immediately returned to Ethan standing beneath the ballroom lights, laughing about her silence, joking about her inability to make decisions. She closed her eyes briefly. The memory no longer felt embarrassing. It felt important. Because for the first time in years, silence was about to stop protecting everyone else. Claire slipped her phone back into her purse and rose from the chair. Behind the ballroom doors, the celebration continued. Ahead of her, however, something much larger was beginning. And buried inside the oldest documents the company possessed was a name that almost nobody remembered seeing anymore. Her own. The next morning arrived wrapped in gray clouds and the quiet hum of downtown traffic. Claire Bennett sat near the window of a small law office overlooking the city. A ceramic cup of coffee rested untouched beside her. Across the table, attorney Daniel Harper carefully organized a stack of documents that looked older than some of the employees currently working at Bennett Dynamics. The room smelled faintly of paper and polished wood. Outside, people hurried along crowded sidewalks without realizing that a 15-year-old story was beginning to reopen. Daniel adjusted his glasses and slid a folder toward her. "I reviewed everything twice," he said. Claire looked down at the documents. "And?" Daniel paused. "The records are authentic." She already expected that answer. What unsettled her was how certain he sounded. Daniel opened the folder and revealed copies of the earliest incorporation papers. The edges appeared slightly worn despite being preserved digitally for years. Claire recognized every page immediately. Back then, she and Ethan were not discussing board governance or corporate strategy. They were discussing rent payments, office furniture, and whether they could afford a second computer. Daniel pointed toward a section highlighted in yellow. "This is where things become interesting." Claire leaned forward. The ownership allocation remained exactly as she remembered. Her name appeared first. Ethan's appeared second. Not because she demanded it. Because she provided the original funding when nobody else believed the company would survive. Years ago, both of them agreed the arrangement was temporary. Later they became busy. Then successful. Then comfortable. Eventually nobody revisited it. Daniel tapped another page. "The problem is that everyone assumed later documents replaced these." Claire frowned. "Did they not?" "No." He slid another file across the table. "Several amendments changed operational authority, not altered foundational ownership." Claire stared at the page. A strange silence settled over the room. For years, she assumed the legal structure evolved beyond anything established during those early days. Apparently it had not. Ethan became the public face, the chief executive officer, the decision maker. Yet ownership remained rooted in documents almost everyone forgot existed. Daniel folded his hands. "Claire, I need to ask something." "What?" "Did Ethan know?" She looked toward the window. Morning sunlight was beginning to break through the clouds. The question lingered longer than expected. Finally she answered honestly, "I do not know." And that was the truth. Early in the marriage, she believed he understood every document they signed. Later, she stopped asking. The company grew too quickly. New executives arrived. New lawyers joined. Life became crowded with meetings, travel schedules, and endless responsibilities. Somewhere along the way, assumptions replaced conversations. Daniel nodded slowly. "The board certainly does not know." Claire looked back at him. "You are sure?" "Very." He opened another folder. Inside sat documents related to the upcoming governance meeting. The annual board review would occur in less than 2 weeks. Several leadership recommendations had already been submitted. One proposal involved expanding executive authority. Another involved restructuring voting procedures. Claire studied the papers carefully. Then her eyes stopped on a familiar name. Ethan Bennett, proposed chairman of the board. She almost smiled. The timing felt unbelievable. Daniel noticed her reaction. "What are you thinking?" Claire closed the folder gently. "That life has a strange sense of humor." Daniel laughed quietly. Then his expression grew serious. "There is something else." He reached for a final document. This one appeared newer than the others. "I received this from corporate records yesterday." Claire accepted the page. Her eyes moved quickly across the text, then stopped. The document listed voting rights connected to ownership percentages. She read it again, then a third time. Daniel waited patiently. Eventually she looked up. "This cannot be correct." "It is." Claire lowered her eyes back to the page. The implications were staggering. Ownership did not simply represent financial value. It represented control, voting authority, governance power, strategic influence. For 15 years, she avoided those conversations. Not because she lacked interest, because she trusted Ethan. Now the same documents everyone ignored were suddenly impossible to ignore. Daniel leaned forward. "What do you want to do?" Claire looked down at the papers scattered across the table. Memories flooded her mind. Long nights inside the first office. Shared dreams. Empty bank accounts. Celebrating their first client. Building something together. None of those memories felt connected to power. Yet power was exactly what these documents represented. After several moments, she finally answered. "Nothing." Daniel blinked. "Nothing?" "Not yet." He studied her face carefully. "Most people would react differently." Claire smiled faintly. "Most people have spent 15 years trying to be heard." She gathered the documents and returned them to the folder. The silence between them felt different now. Not passive. Not weak. Intentional. Outside, the city continued moving through another ordinary morning. Inside that office, however, a forgotten truth was quietly waiting for the right moment to emerge. And less than 2 weeks from now, an entire boardroom would discover that the company they believed belonged to Ethan Bennett rested on a foundation carrying someone else's name. The days leading up to the board meeting passed with surprising normalcy. That was what unsettled Claire Bennett the most. The city continued moving. Employees arrived at work each morning. Executives attended meetings. Investors reviewed reports. Ethan Bennett carried on exactly as he always had, completely unaware that a forgotten chapter of the company's history was quietly making its way back into the present. Claire never mentioned the documents. She never discussed the ownership records. She never corrected anyone's assumptions. Instead, she continued her routine. Every morning she arrived early at the corporate headquarters. She greeted receptionists by name. She checked on ongoing community projects supported by the company. She reviewed employee wellness initiatives and scholarship programs that rarely appeared in earnings reports. Most people associated Bennett Dynamics with revenue growth and market expansion. Claire always cared more about the people inside the building than the numbers appearing on financial statements. On Thursday afternoon, she stood near a conference room window overlooking the city while employees prepared for an upcoming charity fundraiser. The event would provide educational grants to local students. Claire listened as a young coordinator explained the final details. The woman looked nervous. It was her first major project. Claire smiled and encouraged her. The relief on the coordinator's face was immediate. Moments like that mattered more to Claire than executive titles ever could. As she left the conference room, she noticed Ethan speaking with several board members near the executive offices. Their conversation seemed animated. Laughter followed. One of the directors clapped Ethan on the shoulder. Another congratulated him on the upcoming governance review. Claire continued walking. Nobody stopped her. Nobody asked her opinion. Nobody considered that the woman carrying a folder through the hallway might possess more authority than anyone currently gathered around Ethan. The irony no longer frustrated her. It simply existed. Later that evening she returned home and found Ethan sitting in his study reviewing presentation materials. Financial forecasts covered the desk. Market projections glowed across multiple computer screens. He looked up briefly as she entered. "Long day?" he asked. "Not particularly." Ethan nodded and returned to his work. The conversation lasted less than 10 seconds. Years ago, evenings felt different. They shared ideas, compared notes, discussed problems together. Somewhere along the way, their partnership transformed into parallel lives moving in the same house. Neither of them could identify the exact moment it happened. Claire quietly walked away and headed toward the kitchen. Through the study doorway, she could still hear Ethan rehearsing portions of an upcoming speech. She paused for a moment, then continued walking. The next morning Daniel Harper called again. Claire stepped outside onto the office terrace before answering. A cool breeze moved between the surrounding buildings. "I have an update," Daniel said. His tone sounded more serious than usual. Claire immediately noticed. "What happened?" "The board meeting agenda was finalized." She waited. "And?" "There is a vote scheduled." Claire remained silent. Daniel continued. "A major vote." Her eyes drifted toward the skyline. "Regarding what?" Another brief pause followed. "Control." The words settled heavily between them. Claire closed her eyes for a moment. Daniel explained that several board members planned to recommend expanding executive authority and consolidating voting structures under Ethan's leadership. Under ordinary circumstances, the proposal would likely pass without resistance. Most directors assumed ownership and control aligned exactly as public perception suggested. They believed Ethan represented the foundation of the company. None of them knew the foundation carried another name. Daniel lowered his voice. "The board believes this is a formality." Claire looked toward the busy streets below. "It is not." "No." Silence followed. The reality of the situation felt increasingly unavoidable. For years, she chose not to exercise authority. For years, she allowed others to assume leadership belonged exclusively to Ethan. Soon those assumptions would collide with legal reality. Yet even now, Claire felt no desire for confrontation. She wanted clarity, not conflict. Truth, not embarrassment. After ending the call, she returned to her office and opened a drawer she rarely used. Inside sat an old photograph. The picture showed a much younger Ethan standing beside a folding table inside their first office. The walls were unfinished. The furniture was mismatched. The company logo had been printed on ordinary paper and taped to the wall behind them. Both of them were smiling. Claire studied the image for several moments. Back then, nobody cared about ownership percentages. Nobody talked about power. They simply wanted the business to survive. She gently placed the photograph back into the drawer. Across town, preparations for the board meeting continued. Executives finalized reports. Directors reviewed proposals. Ethan refined his presentation. Everyone expected a routine vote. Everyone expected another step in the natural progression of his leadership. Nobody anticipated a surprise. Nobody anticipated resistance. And absolutely nobody expected that hidden inside a secured legal archive were documents capable of changing the entire conversation. As the final business day before the meeting came to an end, Claire received one last message from Daniel. The ownership records had been officially certified and added to the review package. This time, there would be no misunderstanding. No missing paperwork. No forgotten history. The truth was now sitting inside the same folders the board would open in a few days. And when they did, the silence Ethan once mocked would finally speak for itself. Monday morning arrived with the kind of calm that often appears before something important changes. The headquarters of Bennett Dynamics stood beneath a bright blue sky, its glass exterior reflecting the city around it. Employees streamed through the entrance carrying coffee cups and laptop bags, unaware that by the end of the week the story they believed about the company might look very different. Claire Bennett arrived shortly after 8 o'clock. She stepped from the elevator onto the executive floor and immediately noticed unusual activity. Assistants moved quickly between offices. Conference rooms had been reserved throughout the day. Several board members, who normally appeared only during quarterly reviews, had already arrived. The annual governance meeting was approaching, and preparations were accelerating. Claire walked quietly through the hallway. People greeted her warmly. She smiled back. Unlike Ethan, she did not command attention when she entered a room. Yet employees often seemed more comfortable around her. They approached her with questions. They shared concerns. They trusted her. That trust had never required a title. Inside a nearby conference room, Ethan stood before a large screen reviewing presentation slides with senior executives. Charts filled the display. Revenue projections. Expansion opportunities. Strategic initiatives. He spoke with the confidence of a man who expected complete support. As Claire passed the doorway, she overheard part of the discussion. "The vote should be straightforward," one director said. Ethan nodded. "It will be." The certainty in his voice caught her attention. Not because he sounded arrogant. Because he sounded completely convinced the future had already been decided. Claire continued walking. She carried no resentment toward him. That surprised even her sometimes. After everything that had happened, bitterness would have been easy. Instead, she felt something closer to disappointment. Ethan was not a villain. He was simply a man who gradually stopped noticing the people standing beside him. By lunchtime, she found herself reviewing historical company archives inside a quiet records room. The request had seemed harmless when she made it. Nobody questioned why she wanted access. Most assumed she was preparing material for the upcoming anniversary publication. In reality, she wanted to revisit the beginning. Old photographs lined the archive shelves. Early marketing brochures sat inside storage boxes. Framed newspaper articles documented milestones long forgotten by newer employees. Claire paused in front of a photograph taken during the company's first year. Ethan stood beside a whiteboard covered with handwritten goals. She stood next to him, holding a stack of folders. Both looked exhausted. Both looked hopeful. The picture captured something she had not seen in years. Partnership. Back then every decision belonged to both of them. Every challenge belonged to both of them. Success belonged to both of them too. Claire carefully returned the photograph to its place. Her phone vibrated. A message from Daniel Harper appeared on the screen. Board packets distributed this morning. Ownership records included. She stared at the message for several seconds. The moment had finally arrived. Directors across the building were now opening folders containing information none of them expected to see. The forgotten documents were no longer hidden. They were official, recognized, impossible to ignore. Claire slipped her phone back into her purse and left the archive room. Throughout the afternoon, she noticed subtle changes. Nothing dramatic, just small moments. A director she rarely spoke with stopped to ask a few questions. Another offered an unusually thoughtful greeting. One board member appeared distracted during a conversation with Ethan. The information was beginning to circulate. Quietly, carefully, like ripples moving across still water. Near the end of the day, Claire stepped onto the rooftop terrace overlooking the city. The skyline glowed beneath the afternoon sun. Far below, traffic moved through the streets in steady lines. She rested her hands against the railing and allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. 15 years. 15 years of work. 15 years of sacrifice. 15 years of choosing peace over recognition. The realization brought an unexpected sense of calm. For so long she believed silence meant disappearing. Now she understood something different. Silence had allowed the truth to remain intact. It had waited patiently while assumptions grew louder around it. Behind her, the terrace door opened. Footsteps approached. Claire turned and saw Ethan. He looked surprised to find her there. "I have been looking for you," he said. "For me?" Ethan nodded. "Several board members asked unusual questions today." Claire said nothing. Ethan studied her expression. "Do you know what is going on?" The wind moved gently across the rooftop. Claire held his gaze for a moment. Then she answered honestly, "Maybe people are finally reading the documents." Confusion flickered across Ethan's face. Before he could respond, Claire offered a small smile and walked past him toward the door. Ethan remained standing beside the railing, watching her leave. For the first time in years, uncertainty appeared in his eyes. And as Claire stepped back inside the building, she realized the board meeting was no longer the only thing approaching. Awareness was coming too. Slowly. Inevitably. And once it arrived, nothing inside Bennett Dynamics would ever look quite the same again. The morning of the board meeting arrived with an unusual stillness. Sunlight reflected across the glass exterior of Bennett Dynamics while executives, directors, and legal advisors gathered inside the headquarters. The atmosphere felt polished and professional, yet beneath the surface something else was moving. Anticipation. Ethan Bennett stood in his office reviewing his presentation one final time. He adjusted a chart on the screen and smiled with quiet confidence. The past several years had strengthened his reputation. Revenue had grown. Investors were satisfied. Industry publications frequently mentioned his leadership. Everything pointed toward a successful vote. Across the building, Claire Bennett sat alone in a smaller conference room. A leather folder rested beside her. The same folder she had carried for days without opening in public. Through the window she watched employees crossing the plaza below. Most had no idea a governance review was taking place upstairs. Their focus remained on deadlines, projects, and ordinary responsibilities. Claire admired that simplicity. For a moment, she wished life could remain that uncomplicated. Her phone vibrated softly. A message from Daniel Harper appeared. The board packets have been reviewed. Questions are already circulating. Claire read the message once before placing the phone face down on the table. She felt calm. more calm than she expected. Weeks earlier, the discovery of the ownership records had unsettled her. Now the truth felt less like a burden and more like an inevitable destination. Shortly before 10 o'clock, directors began arriving at the executive boardroom. The room itself reflected the success of the company. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline. A polished walnut table stretched across the center. Digital displays glowed softly along the walls. Every chair slowly filled. Some directors spoke quietly among themselves. Others reviewed documents. Several exchanged curious glances whenever Claire's name appeared inside the materials. Ethan entered last. As usual, conversations paused briefly when he arrived. He greeted everyone warmly and took a seat near the head of the table. Moments later, Claire entered. Her appearance generated far less attention. Yet several directors looked toward her with noticeably different expressions than before. Not admiration. Not concern. Curiosity. Claire quietly took her seat and organized a few papers. Ethan noticed the subtle shift immediately. He looked around the room. Something felt different. He simply could not identify what. The meeting began. Financial results were reviewed first. Revenue targets. Market performance. Expansion opportunities. Ethan delivered each section smoothly. Years of public speaking had refined his presentation style. Directors nodded frequently. Questions were answered efficiently. Everything appeared to be proceeding exactly as planned. Yet Claire noticed something unusual. Several board members seemed distracted. Their attention drifted repeatedly toward the legal packets resting beside them. One director highlighted multiple sections. Another wrote notes in the margins. Ethan continued speaking, unaware of the growing undercurrent. Nearly 2 hours passed before governance discussions finally appeared on the agenda. The room grew quieter. This was the portion Ethan cared about most. He stood and moved toward the main display. A slide titled Leadership Structure and Future Direction appeared on the screen. Ethan spoke confidently about continuity, stability, and long-term planning. He explained why consolidating authority would create greater efficiency. He outlined future initiatives. The presentation was polished, persuasive, professional. When he finished, several directors applauded politely. Ethan returned to his seat believing the hardest part of the day was over. Then board chair Margaret Sullivan adjusted her glasses and looked toward the legal counsel seated near the end of the table. "Before we proceed to voting," she said, "there appears to be a matter requiring clarification." Ethan frowned slightly. That sentence was not part of the schedule. The legal counsel nodded. Several directors immediately opened their packets. Papers shifted across the table. Claire remained still. Margaret glanced toward Ethan. "Recent document verification uncovered records related to original ownership structure." Silence settled across the room. Ethan looked confused. "Ownership structure?" "Yes." Margaret carefully opened a folder. "The findings raise questions regarding voting authority." Ethan leaned back slowly. Around him, directors exchanged measured looks. Nobody appeared hostile. Yet nobody looked comfortable either. Claire watched quietly as realization began forming around the table. The conversation she expected for weeks was finally beginning. Ethan turned toward the board chair. "I am not sure I understand." Margaret folded her hands. "That is exactly why we need clarification." At the far end of the table, legal counsel reached for a document marked with certification seals. The room became completely silent. Outside the windows, the city continued moving as though nothing important was happening. Inside, however, 15 years of assumption stood on the edge of examination. Ethan's confident expression faded for the first time all morning. And as the certified documents were placed at the center of the table, everyone understood that the most important part of the meeting had not yet begun. The certified documents rested at the center of the boardroom table like a forgotten piece of history that had suddenly become impossible to ignore. No one spoke for several seconds. The silence felt heavier than any presentation, any financial report, or any strategic proposal discussed that morning. Ethan Bennett sat motionless, his attention fixed on the papers in front of him. Across the room, Claire Bennett remained calm. She had imagined this moment many times over the previous weeks, yet now that it had arrived, she felt no excitement, only clarity. Board Chair Margaret Sullivan looked toward legal counsel. "Please proceed." The attorney opened the folder carefully. Several directors leaned forward in their seats. Others exchanged uncertain glances. The room, that normally moved with confidence, now felt cautious. Measured. Respectful. The attorney adjusted his glasses and began speaking. During a routine governance review, several original incorporation records were located and subsequently verified through certified archives. He paused briefly. The documents have been reviewed by independent counsel and confirmed as legally valid. Ethan folded his hands together. And what exactly do these documents change? His tone remained professional, but everyone could hear the tension beneath it. The attorney looked down at the records. The ownership structure of Bennett Dynamics. A quiet murmur spread around the table. Margaret immediately raised her hand, restoring order. The attorney continued. Over the years, operational authority and executive responsibilities evolved through various amendments. However, foundational ownership remained unchanged. Claire watched several directors turn pages inside their packets. Expressions shifted. Eyebrows lifted. Pens stopped moving. The information was finally reaching everyone at the same time. Ethan shook his head slightly. There must be some misunderstanding. The attorney remained calm. There is no misunderstanding. Another page was placed on the screen at the front of the room. The original incorporation agreement appeared in large text. Names, signatures, percentages, dates. Everything preserved exactly as it existed 15 years earlier. Ethan stared at the screen. For the first time that morning, he looked genuinely surprised. One director cleared his throat softly. Another removed his glasses and studied the display more carefully. Claire remained silent. She felt every eye gradually shifting between her and the screen. Yet she refused to look away from the documents. This was never about attention. It was about truth. The attorney continued. The original funding contribution, founding ownership allocation, and controlling voting position were assigned at incorporation. He paused again. Those assignments remain legally active. The room grew even quieter. Margaret looked toward Ethan. Were you aware of this? Ethan hesitated. The hesitation itself seemed to answer the question. Not completely, he admitted. Several directors exchanged glances. Nobody appeared angry. They simply looked surprised. The company, they thought, they understood suddenly contained a chapter few had ever seen. Ethan looked toward Claire. You knew? Claire met his gaze calmly. I recently reviewed the documents again. The answer was simple. Honest. Unemotional. Somehow, that made it more powerful. Ethan leaned back in his chair. His confidence had not disappeared entirely, but it was changing. Cracks were beginning to appear. Margaret folded her hands together. Legal counsel, please clarify the ownership position. Every person in the room focused on the attorney. The city skyline shimmered beyond the windows, but nobody looked outside anymore. Attention belonged entirely to the documents. The attorney opened the final certification packet. According to verified records, the controlling ownership position belongs to Claire Bennett. No one moved. No one spoke. The sentence seemed to suspend itself in the air above the table. Ethan stared forward. Several directors looked down at their packets again, as though hoping the words would somehow change. They did not. The attorney continued. Furthermore, the associated voting authority connected to that ownership position remains fully enforceable. One director slowly lowered his pen. Another sat back in stunned silence. The implications extended far beyond percentages. Governance decisions, leadership appointments, strategic direction, authority itself. Claire watched realization spread across the room one face at a time. Nobody appeared hostile. Nobody appeared judgmental. They simply looked shocked. For years, they assumed the company belonged to the man speaking from stages and appearing in interviews. Now they were learning that the foundation beneath everything carried a different name. Ethan finally looked toward Claire again. This time, there was no confidence in his expression. Only confusion. And perhaps something else. Reflection. Memories seemed to pass behind his eyes. The early office. The startup years. The sacrifices they both made. Details he had not considered in a long time. Margaret broke the silence. Mrs. Bennet? Claire looked up. Yes. Would you like to make a statement before the board proceeds? Every eye turned toward her. The room waited. Claire glanced briefly at the ownership documents. Then at the directors. Then at Ethan. When she finally spoke, her voice remained calm. I did not come here to take anything away from anyone. The silence deepened. I only believe the truth deserves a place in the conversation. No dramatic speech followed. No accusations. No anger. Just a simple sentence. Yet somehow it carried more weight than every presentation delivered that day. Across the table, Ethan lowered his eyes. For the first time since the meeting began, he appeared to understand that the real revelation was not who owned the company. It was how long the truth had been standing quietly beside him without ever demanding recognition. And as the board prepared to move toward its most important vote, everyone in the room realized the story they thought they knew had only just begun to unfold. The boardroom remained silent long after Claire Bennet finished speaking. I did not come here to take anything away from anyone. I only believe the truth deserves a place in the conversation. The sentence lingered in the air because nobody could argue with it. There was no accusation hidden inside her words. No attempt to embarrass anyone. No desire for revenge. Just a simple acknowledgement of reality. For years, the company had operated under assumptions. Today, those assumptions were being replaced by facts. Board Chair Margaret Sullivan slowly closed one of the legal folders and looked around the room. Several directors remained focused on the ownership records spread before them. Others stared quietly at the city skyline beyond the windows, as though trying to process what they had just learned. Ethan Bennet sat motionless. The confidence that had carried him through the morning presentation had faded into reflection. Not anger. Reflection. That surprised Claire. She expected resistance. Instead, she saw something closer to disbelief. One director finally broke the silence. Legal counsel, are there any challenges to the validity of these documents? The attorney answered immediately. None. Another director spoke next. And the voting authority connected to the ownership position remains active? Yes. Pens stopped moving around the table. Questions that once seemed theoretical were suddenly very real. Governance. Authority. Leadership. Every future decision now required acknowledgement of information that had been overlooked for years. Margaret folded her hands together. Then the board must proceed accordingly. Her voice remained calm, but everyone understood the significance of what she was saying. The meeting was no longer about assumptions. It was about documented reality. Ethan finally leaned forward. I need to ask something. The room turned toward him. His voice sounded quieter than usual. If these records have existed all this time, Why did nobody raise the issue earlier? The question was directed generally, but his eyes settled on Claire. She met his gaze. For a moment, she considered the answer carefully. Then she spoke. Because nobody asked. The simplicity of the response seemed to affect him more than any complicated explanation could have. Ethan looked down at the table. Memories appeared to move behind his eyes. 15 years of meetings, decisions, celebrations, public interviews, countless opportunities to ask questions, countless opportunities to listen more carefully. Yet the questions never came. Margaret glanced toward Claire. Mrs. Bennet, would you like the board to recognize your controlling ownership position formally? Several directors waited for her response. This was the moment many expected. The moment where power changed hands. The moment where someone finally stepped forward to claim authority. Claire surprised them all. The position already exists, she said gently. Recognition does not change it. Several directors exchanged thoughtful looks. Once again, she refused to make the conversation about herself. That refusal carried its own kind of strength. The board spent the next hour reviewing governance implications. Legal counsel explained procedures. Directors discussed responsibilities. Every recommendation was evaluated through the lens of the newly confirmed ownership structure. Throughout the discussion, Claire spoke only when necessary. Ethan spoke less than anyone had expected. Occasionally he reviewed the original incorporation documents again. Each time his attention returned to the same signatures. The same names. The same beginning. At one point, he quietly asked to see a certified copy. The attorney handed it to him. Ethan studied the pages for a long moment. Then he smiled sadly. I remember this office. No one responded immediately. Ethan continued looking at the document. We could barely afford the rent. Claire nodded softly. I remember. The printer never worked. A few directors laughed quietly. Even Claire smiled. That part one definitely remember. For the first time all day, the tension eased slightly. Not because the situation had become less important. Because something more human had entered the room. Shared history. Shared effort. Shared sacrifice. Ethan looked at the signatures again. I had forgotten how much you carried back then. The admission was barely above a whisper. Yet everyone heard it. Claire looked toward the windows for a moment before answering. We both carried a lot. The response reflected exactly who she was. Even now she refused to diminish his contributions. She simply wanted hers acknowledged too. As the afternoon sun shifted across the boardroom floor, the final governance review came to an end. Margaret organized the remaining documents and prepared for the concluding vote. Yet before proceeding, she paused. I have chaired boards for more than 20 years, she said. I have seen disagreements over power, ownership, and leadership. Her eyes moved around the room. I do not believe I have ever seen a situation handled with more dignity. Several directors nodded. Claire lowered her eyes slightly. Ethan remained silent. The board members prepared their voting materials. The future direction of the company would soon be decided. But something more important had already happened. The truth was no longer hidden. The woman many viewed as quiet support standing in the background had finally been seen clearly. And as the directors reached for their ballots, Ethan realized that the greatest revelation was not who owned the company. It was how easily he had overlooked the person who helped build it beside him from the very beginning. The final vote concluded shortly before sunset. One by one, board members submitted their decisions. Legal counsel verified the results. Governance procedures were completed. Every requirement had been satisfied. Yet when the formalities ended, nobody rushed to leave. The room remained unusually quiet. It was not because people were focused on the outcome, The outcome itself no longer felt like the most important part of the day. The truth was, Board Chair Margaret Sullivan carefully gathered the remaining documents and looked around the table. "I believe we have completed all official business." Several directors nodded. Normally, that sentence triggered immediate movement. Laptops closed. Phones appeared. Meetings ended. Today was different. People lingered. Thoughtful expressions remained fixed on faces throughout the room. 15 years of assumptions had changed in a single afternoon. Claire Bennett quietly organized her papers. The same leather folder that had traveled with her throughout the week now rested on the table. Inside were documents she never intended to use as weapons. Only evidence. Evidence that truth eventually finds its way into the light. Across the room, Ethan Bennett remained seated. He had spoken very little during the final portion of the meeting. Not because he lacked something to say. Because for perhaps the first time in years, he was listening instead. Listening to facts. Listening to history. Listening to silence. The silence he once joked about. The silence he once mistook for weakness. One by one, directors began leaving the boardroom. Several paused beside Claire's chair. Some offered congratulations. Others offered respect. None of them spoke about money. That surprised her. Instead, they spoke about integrity, patience, grace, words that mattered far more. Eventually, only a few people remained. Margaret gathered her folders and smiled warmly. "Mrs. Bennett?" Claire looked up. "Yes. Thank you for how you handled today." Claire returned the smile. "Thank you for listening." Margaret nodded before leaving the room. The door closed softly behind her. Silence settled once more. This time, only Claire and Ethan remained. Outside the windows, the city glowed beneath the colors of late afternoon. Traffic lights flickered to life. Buildings reflected orange sunlight across their glass surfaces. For a long moment neither person spoke. Then Ethan finally broke the silence. "I kept thinking about that photograph." Claire looked toward him. "Which one?" "The first office." A faint smile appeared on her face. "The printer that never worked?" Ethan laughed quietly. "That one." The laughter faded. A different emotion remained behind it. Regret. "I remembered something today," he said. Claire waited. "When we signed those papers." His eyes moved toward the city beyond the glass. "You told me none of it would matter if we stopped respecting each other." Claire remembered. The conversation happened late at night after they finished reviewing incorporation documents. They were exhausted. Optimistic. Young. Back then the future felt endless. Ethan lowered his eyes. "I forgot." The admission carried no excuses. No attempts to defend himself. Just honesty. Claire studied him quietly. She could see the weight of realization settling onto his shoulders. Not because of ownership records. Not because of governance authority. Because he finally understood what had been lost long before the meeting ever happened. Recognition. Partnership. Appreciation. Things more valuable than titles. Ethan looked at her. "You should have said something." Claire considered the statement carefully. Then she smiled gently. "Maybe." A few seconds passed. "But you could have asked." The words landed softly. Yet they carried the truth both of them needed to hear. Ethan nodded slowly. There was nothing to argue with. The room fell silent again. This silence felt different from all the others. Not uncomfortable. Not painful. Honest. Eventually Claire stood and picked up her folder. The day was over. The meeting was finished. The truth had spoken for itself. She walked toward the door. Before reaching it, she paused briefly. Ethan remained seated at the table where he had spent years believing he understood the entire story. Now he knew there had always been another chapter. One he never bothered to read. Claire. She turned. Yes. Ethan held her gaze for a moment. I am sorry. No dramatic speech followed. No elaborate explanation. Just 2 words. Claire looked at him quietly. Then she nodded. I know. And somehow, that answer carried more peace than forgiveness alone. She opened the boardroom door and stepped into the hallway. Evening sunlight stretched across the floor. Employees were beginning to leave for the day. Conversations echoed softly through the building. Life continued. Claire walked toward the elevator with a calm expression. She had not won because she owned the company. She had not won because documents proved her right. She had not won because someone else lost. She had won because she no longer needed anyone's permission to know her worth. Behind her, the boardroom door remained closed. Ahead of her, the future waited. As the elevator doors opened, Claire stepped inside and glanced once more toward the skyline. The city looked exactly the same as it had yesterday. Yet everything felt different. Not because power had changed hands. Because the truth had finally been seen. The woman who spent years standing quietly in the background had never needed to speak louder. She only needed to stop carrying the burden of proving what was already true. And as the elevator descended toward the lobby, Claire smiled softly. The company might have been what they built together. But peace was something she built for herself.